Hello, welcome to Newscast, where so often on a Thursday we have a very domestic political focus. Today we are broadening things out, as you might imagine, in the context of what's going on in the Middle East, and it is something of a BBC podcast mashup, really, because there's Newscast, we've been around for a little while, haven't we? But there is also The Conflict, a new podcast with our colleague Lyse Doucet at the heart of it, examining day-by-day events in the Middle East. And Lyse, you're very welcome as we come together, two podcasts in one today.
It's really good to join you, Chris. Good to be on your podcast, and I hope you're happy to be on mine.
We certainly are. Welcome to Newscast and to The Conflict.
Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
It's day 13 of the Israel-Gaza war, and today began with a rare glimmer of hope that the US President Joe Biden, who was in Israel yesterday, had secured an agreement with Israel and Egypt to allow a first convoy, 20 trucks of desperately needed food, water, medicine, to enter the Gaza Strip through the southern crossing at Rafah with Egypt. But as the day draws to a close, there's an even louder chorus of voices saying that's simply not enough aid to respond to Gaza's deepening humanitarian crisis. More than 60 international charities are now calling for a humanitarian ceasefire. And there were more Israeli airstrikes against Gaza throughout the day, including one against the southern city of Khan Yunis, where more gruesome images emerged of an area which came under attack. Children and UN workers are reported to be among the dead and injured. And in the midst of this crisis, the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, landed in Tel Aviv, in his words, to stand with Israel in its darkest hour, after what he called the horrific acts of terrorism which sparked this crisis. Hamas's killing of more than 1,300 Israelis in southern Israel on October the 7th, and the seizing of more than 200 hostages. And in this episode, I'm joined by Jeremy Bowen to discuss all the latest developments in this region and beyond, and to ask what happens next. Let's listen to what the Prime Minister had to say.
I'm proud to stand here with you in Israel's darkest hour. As your friend, we will stand with you in solidarity, we will stand with your people, and we also want you to win.
Thank you.
Chris, why do you think it was so important for Rishi Sunak to make the trip to Tel Aviv and spend most of the day in Jerusalem?
I think the idea behind it, Lyse, from Downing Street's perspective, speaking to people travelling with the Prime Minister, was a sense that they needed to match their words with actions, that they felt that they wanted the Prime Minister to be there to express his solidarity with Israel face to face, and that was something that was recognised and acknowledged and appreciated by Benjamin Netanyahu in that address that we heard from the two of them a few hours ago. And then also, I think, to seize this moment in this potentially narrowing window before an escalation in the conflict in terms of Israel and a ground invasion into Gaza, to go and make the argument that, yes, there is, from a UK government perspective, a solidarity with Israel. Yes, there is a recognition that Israel should be able to defend itself, but also a desire from the Prime Minister to express face-to-face a desire that there's a certain calibration, if you like, attached to that response. And then as far as the broader trip is concerned, he'll be travelling around the region until Friday afternoon. He's in Saudi Arabia tonight. I think he's pressing the case around trying to dampen down the likelihood of a sort of wider regional flare-up. And the argument that they're making, when journalists like me say to number 10 officials, what difference can the UK actually make, is they say, look, there is an element, if you like, of coordination here with the visit of the German Chancellor the other day, the US President yesterday, and the likelihood that the French President will head to the region when he can. And they are all broadly articulating a similar message.
Chris, do you think it's possible to say what the mood is in the United Kingdom about this escalating crisis?
Couple of observations on that, at least. One is a narrow political one, and the other's a bit more broad and therefore perhaps a little bit more speculative. On the political side, we've just come out of the party conference season here in the UK, as you know, with a general election increasingly imminent. In other words, politics was getting increasingly noisy and tribal and domestic focused, because general election campaigns tend to be. And then for the last 13 days, things have changed and the tone has changed. And you've seen the Prime Minister and the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, pretty much at one in terms of their outlook on what has happened. Yes, there are disagreements, relatively mildly expressed within Parliament at the moment. It's about 30 Labour MPs who have joined the Scottish National Party in arguing that there should be a ceasefire, which is a very different position from the government's position, or indeed the Labour frontbench position. I think beyond that, amongst the wider UK, if you like, I just think perhaps just that collective sense of horror, really, and perhaps as well a sense that because the issues between Israel and the Palestinians haven't commanded as much attention perhaps in recent years as they have in the past, and the international focus has been on what's been going on in Ukraine, as well as a lot of concern that people in the UK have about their own their own situation around the cost of living and all the rest of it, that a combination of that kind of horror as well as trying to grapple with an understanding of what is going on. And it's where Lyse and Jeremy and all your colleagues there reporting on this minute by minute are helping the rest of us not just understand what's happening minute by minute, but understand why it's happening and the context of what's going on and the geography on the ground and all those things that, for those of us who just look in on the Middle East when it does generate headlines, come to with a fair dollop of ignorance, to be honest.
Yes, it was interesting at the start of this crisis. One of the biggest questions asked on internet search engines was, where is the Gaza Strip? And young people were asking about it too, which is a very good sign that they took an interest in it. It is, you use the word horror. I think that there has been horror. There was horror on October the 7th at those grisly scenes here in southern Israel as Hamas fighters managed to break through Israel's what was thought to be an impenetrable fence and then rampaged through kibbutzes and towns. And now, of course, and then take more than 200 Israelis and other nationals hostage. And then since then, the horror of what's happening in the Gaza Strip. Jeremy, you're looking at this really, really closely. And we've seen one after the other, the German Chancellor, the American President, now Britain's Prime Minister, coming here to show they are a friend of Israel. But they also want to show they're a friend of the Arab world, too, of the Palestinians. It's a tricky balancing act, isn't it?
It is a tricky balancing act, but it's a really hard circle to square in that if you look at the very belligerent rhetoric coming from the Israelis, things like we have to wipe Hamas off the face of the planet. And that, of course, is based on the immense trauma that Israelis have suffered, this enormous number of casualties. And every day more detail comes out in the media, websites, on the radio, on the TV. They identify more bodies, they tell more stories. So it's not like the trauma is dying down. Far from it. It's a continuing process. So I think that very much stiffens the resolve of the Israelis to continue on their military course, no doubt about that. So then there's the other side of it, which is an awful lot of Palestinian civilians, thousands, several thousand, in Gaza have been killed, including a lot of children. It's got a very young, about half the population of Gaza are kids. So it's got a very young population, and a lot of those have been killed. So the way that Israel's allies have been pitching it is, yes, we support you. Yes, you have to do what you have to do. Yes, we absolutely back your right of self-defense. But don't forget international humanitarian law, also known as the laws of war, and in very detailed, massive conventions and so on. But a key thing is that under the terms of those laws, civilians and civilian infrastructure, things like water plants, water desalination, wastewater, that kind of thing, all that is supposedly protected. In other words, armies have to work very, very hard not to hit them. Israel says it's doing just that. Hamas fires out of populated areas and they go after them, and then people who are basically human shields die. Others say that Israel is not restraining itself. And so, to get onto the bit about the Arab side, the thing is that a lot of Arab leaders, to be honest, are fed up with the Palestinian issue. They would rather they didn't have to deal with it. They've tried to ignore it in recent years. Among others, the Emiratis and the UAE have done a deal brokered by Donald Trump, the so-called Abraham Accords, to normalize things with Israel. President Biden, was working towards trying to do something similar with the Saudis, and until, well, less than 2 weeks ago, they were from time to time hinting that they were making progress on it. Now, all that is on one side, because the thing is that those Arab leaders, while I mean, to a large degree or other, they're all autocrats of different sorts. They're not democracies. They have to reflect the mood of people in their populations. And while leaders may find the Palestinian issue to be something they'd rather not have to think about, it's something like no other issue, really, that can bring thousands of Arabs out onto the streets, and we're trying to see that kind of thing. So where does this go? Why does that matter? Well, it's the last part of my answer. Think back to 2011, when uprisings swept right across the Arab Middle East, and also the wars that came out of that, in some cases, are still going. So think about the seismic impact all that had, and it also had a seismic impact on the leaders of those countries, who said, wait a minute, what was the spark for those uprisings? It was one market trader in a very poor, remote town in Tunisia, but getting so frustrated with the way things were, corrupt officialdom, poverty, he set himself on fire. And that started all of it off. That was literally the spark. So if you compare one man doing that with the potentiality of thousands and thousands of Palestinian civilians being killed in Gaza, well, I think they're thinking, we've got to get on side with our own people here. So they have all, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, all friends of America, all to a greater or lesser degree friends of Israel. They've all put out statements roundly condemning what Israel's done. Way different to anything coming from Western countries.
And Jeremy, picking up on that point, can you give us some sense of the scale, as you see it, of the moment the Middle East confronts now, with all of those moments that you've covered in recent decades in the region? How big is this?
Well, the Middle East is turbulent, it's volatile, there's often violence, there have been quite a few wars. I think this is really big. Why do I think that? Because I think the size of it and the time that it's happening, the combination of other factors that are happening, the way that different countries have been, say, pulling away from being too reliant on America, the fact that there's this incipient, growing conflict there's one big fault. The Middle East is full of fault lines. And one big fault line in it is between friends of America and friends of Iran. And that fault line is really agitated at the moment. And that's where the fear of a spread of the war comes from. So I think the big fear is that this war could expand, that Iran might get involved. Hezbollah, Iran's allies in Lebanon, might get involved. They're very, very heavily armed and a genuine military threat to Israel in a way that Hamas is not. Militarily, they're not. Their gunmen got in, took the border guards by surprise, killed, massacred something over 1,400 people, but they weren't an organized military threat in the way that Hezbollah is. So I think this is a key moment, because if it does spread, it's really going to change the way the Middle East is. It might anyway, and it's the start of essentially there was a status quo. It wasn't a great status quo. No one really liked the status quo, but it was a status quo. You more or less knew where you were. Even with military exchanges between Hamas and Israel, they followed the same pattern: exchanges of missiles, airstrikes, within 10 days, 15 days or something, the Egyptians would broker a ceasefire. It's not like that this time round. And the special envoy to the Middle East peace process, a veteran diplomat from Norway called Tor Venesland, who is a I know him personally, and he is not an alarmist. He did a briefing to the UN Security Council. He's been traveling the region. He was in Doha. He did a briefing from there to the UN Security Council. And if you read it, it's online. It is, he says, for example, I am very, 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 I think it was 3 times very, worried about this spreading. He said it is the result. He went into the political background of it all. He said this has come about because for a century there's been a conflict between Arabs and Jews in this land. For more than 50 years there's been this issue about the occupation of the territories that Israel captured in the 1967 Middle East War, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and they also captured Gaza, though they're not formally occupying it, of course, at the moment. And because, he said, the international community had failed to resolve this in an equitable way, that is why we are seeing what we're seeing. He doesn't see this as an event that has its roots in last year or the year before. He's gone back, I'd say quite correctly, a century.
One thing we love doing on Newscast is hearing from you as newscasters with your questions to the people that we're talking to, and who better as we try and understand what's going on in the Middle East than Jeremy and Lyse. Alex in Solihull, Lyse, has been in touch saying, I'm keen to understand the positions of Iran and Saudi Arabia on the current conflict. Jeremy, you kicked that around a few minutes ago to a degree. Do you want to pick that up, Lyse, in terms of what Alex is asking?
Well, I'll pick up on what Jeremy said, in which the leaders of this region, including most of all Israel, but also the other Arab powerhouses, just wanted the Palestinian issue to go away. Even Iran and Saudi Arabia, arch rivals. Saudi Arabia, the big Sunni power in the region, Iran, the big Shia power, the 2 main branches of Islam, even came towards a rapprochement, an extraordinary rapprochement. Maybe it was partial, but they seemed to put aside some of their very, very deep differences to try to quell some of the fires in this region and to try to deal with them. Saudi Arabia was spending a lot of time trying to deal with the crisis in Yemen, its rivalry with Iran, and, as Jeremy mentioned, it was moving toward what would have been an extraordinary moment for Saudi Arabia, which is the custodian of the 2 holiest shrines in Islam, to recognize the Jewish state. And the de facto ruler, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, recently said that they were making progress. And then, as always, you can't forget the Palestinian crisis. You can't put it in a box because it is going to explode. And so it has exploded. Initially, of course, no one else wanted to get drawn into it. But now, as it continues to escalate, as the numbers of casualties rise, as more horrific images, and I'm afraid there is an air raid siren now, I think Jeremy and I are going to have to run to the bunker. That we'll be back in a minute.
I don't have to because I'm in Jerusalem.
Blimey, that a reminder of the reality minute by minute for so many people in the region, and you guys there reporting upon it. Do you want to pick up on that thought, actually? You're picking up on what you were saying a few minutes ago, actually, Jeremy, in response to the question from Alex in Solihull. We were hearing there from Lyse about Saudi Arabia and its role, but can you tell us more about Iran? The centrality of Iran in all of these conversations. You talked about the Friends of America, the Friends of Iran a few minutes ago as one of the axes, if you like, that run through so many discussions on the Middle East.
Well, Iran, as you know, is it sees itself, the clerics who rule it see it as a revolutionary Islamic society. I think a lot of the people, I haven't been to Iran for some years because they don't give us visas anymore. For the BBC and for most foreign journalists, but we're particularly unpopular. They have their military strategy it's one, I suppose you could call it forward defense. They have built up a web of alliances in the region, and they have some important allies. They have an alliance in Yemen at the foot of Arabia, below Saudi Arabia, with the Houthis, which are the group that control the capital of that country and large parts of it. They have an alliance with President Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and the most significant one militarily, as far as this crisis is concerned, is the one they have with Hezbollah. Hezbollah are a military, political, and social movement, a Shia Muslim movement inside Lebanon. They have become, over many years of fighting Israel, they became a very effective military force. They have also fought extensively in the war in Syria over the last 10 years or so. So they have a lot of experienced men. Iran has also armed them with a huge arsenal. I mean, there are different estimates, but all of them well over 100,000 missiles and rockets of different sorts. Some of them very long range, you could say hit Tel Aviv, in their arsenal. Now, Israel is also very powerful, but they're aware of how powerful the two forces are. There was a big war in 2006 when Hezbollah basically fought Israel to a standstill. So the significance, I think, of Iran in all this, to answer your question directly, is that the feeling is that if Iran, there's a man called Hassan Nasrallah who's the leader of Hezbollah. He's very close to the Iranians. That if the Iranians say, time has come, press the button, go, because they feel that they can take advantage of it, because they feel perhaps that so many Palestinians have died, they need to do something, they feel some pressure into it, I think they would be reluctant to do it, because I think the region would explode if that happened. I don't think they want to do that. I don't think they see the upsides particularly, but it's not impossible. And when escalation starts happening, say around the Lebanese-Israel border, and they've been exchanging fire pretty much every day, now if that suddenly blew up, then it would be very hard to control it, and it would be a highly dangerous crisis that would affect the whole region. So those are the kinds of stakes that people are talking about. That's why President Biden moved not one, but two carrier battle groups, immensely powerful projections of American power, into the Eastern Mediterranean, to send a message to the Iranians particularly, and also Hezbollah, saying, if you get involved in this, it's not just Israel you're getting involved with. You're getting involved with us. So watch out. I mean, that is why Biden says his advice to countries who might want to take advantage of what they might see as Israeli weakness right now is don't.
Lyse, I think you're back with us. What happened there, and how often are things like that happening where you are?
Well, the sirens are part of the rhythm of life here now. Many Israelis have left this area close to the border with Gaza. They've been either told by the government, or they know it's just going to be safer for them to be away, especially if this war escalates and more rockets come across the border. But for those of us who are here, you have to take the sirens seriously. And we go in and out of the shelters several times a day. And earlier today, when we were much closer to the border, you can actually feel the rockets going past, and there's just a rush and a roar, and people start shouting, and you go into the bomb shelter. Even when you're broadcasting, you just drop everything and go. You don't have to stay long in the bomb shelter, and almost everywhere you go, almost every street has a bomb shelter, so you always know that there's somewhere where you can take cover. Jeremy, I know you've got to go now, but I've got more work to do, but thanks so much for spending some time with us on both Newscast and the Conflict podcast, 2 in 1.
Thanks, Jeremy. Nice to talk to you.
Always a pleasure.
Lyse, a question that has been rattling around in my mind today, keeping an eye on the British Prime Minister's visit to the region, is I wonder, in your judgment, how much difference in this visit, alongside the visits of President Biden and Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, potentially the French President too, what difference they're likely to have or not in the minds of the Israeli government as it contemplates not just what it does next, but the scale of what it does next. I guess, to put the question more bluntly, what difference does a visit like Rishi Sunak's actually make?
This image, this very public show of support by one Western leader after another, they know it's not enough at this moment, to use the Prime Minister's phrase, Israel's darkest hour, to do something. You have to be seen to do something. But when Rishi Sunak comes here and sits down and has first a public statements with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, then he goes and speaks behind closed doors. Of course, a lot of important information is exchanged, but it's not the same as when Joe Biden comes to visit, Israel's staunchest ally, a country which gives Israel nearly $4 billion in financial and military aid every year. It is the country which matters. And not only did Joe Biden have those private conversations, he was actually meeting the war cabinet, and his officials were almost taking part in a war cabinet meeting. They were hands-on. They were doing deals on this aid agreement. So they make a much more concrete difference. But they also know, they want to know that Britain is with them, that Germany, that France, others are with them. And that matters. Israel right now wants to know the world is on its side. That does matter a lot.
And in terms of a ground invasion, Lyse, of Gaza by Israel, how soon do we think that's going to happen?
Everyone is asking, everyone is thinking about this. It's so much so that the spokesperson for the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, said, everyone is talking about this. We might do something different. Surprise is an important element in any military operation. But of course, Israel isn't hiding the fact. In fact, it's making it clear that more than 300,000 of its soldiers have been massing along the border. It has moved armor and artillery there, and we've seen it when we've been able to get closer to the closed military zone. But it's phases. So there is the nightly and daily bombardment. There are, what the IDF has said, at least on one occasion and possibly more, when they've made raids into the northern Gaza Strip with reconnaissance teams. They have some work to do before they take the very risky maneuvers to go in on the ground. Decades of Israeli leaders, including Benjamin Netanyahu, have resisted this full frontal ground invasion of Gaza because they know the risk is high for their soldiers, the risk is high of civilian casualties. Urban warfare anywhere is complex and it is very dangerous. And Gaza, being one of the most densely populated places on earth, they've prepared for it, but they know it'll be a challenge. And on top of it, there are those hostages. And, the families of the hostages worry that they will be made to pay the price. And once the Israeli forces go in, as is widely expected, that the hostages will then become, their lives will be at greater risk. So some people say it will start this weekend. Some people say it will take weeks. And the Israelis say, we're not telling you. When it happens, you'll know.
Lyse, it's been a privilege to be in your company and Jeremy's company over the last half an hour, so I've certainly learnt a lot. And as newscasters, you can keep across all of the developments from Jeremy and from Lyse and from all of our colleagues in the Middle East on the Conflict podcast, which you can find on BBC Sounds, as well as, of course, as Newscast. We will, follow each and every development in the coming days, weeks, and perhaps months. So from all of us, for now, thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.